let's turn our attention to the business of the day. And as many of you have said, it's story time today. And I know the deep dives usually do tell a story, but we always, usually at least, try and analyse a piece of music. Not so today. We have actually discussed Vivaldi in quite some depth at one of my previous deep dives where we looked at the Dixit Dominus. And I do have a plan to go through the Gloria in some detail, looking at the individual movements. But I couldn't go any further into deep diving into Vivaldi without telling you about the rediscovery of the Gloria and many other great works. Because, well, I want to start by asking you how many times you've sung or heard Vivaldi's Gloria. Have a think to yourself. I imagine most of you watching have sung it before. If you're in this choir, you've sung part of it. If you're in Choir of the Earth, you've sung all of it. You may well have heard it before. It is one of the all-time great pieces. It is a mainstay of the choral repertory, but chances are you never gave the score that you hold in your hands. It probably looked something like this, or maybe it's the Novello edition, but the Ricordi was the first full edition. Chances are you never really gave it any thought. It was just a piece of music that you're singing that week. But the story of the Gloria and the works that surround it is one of the most intense and dramatic in all of music making. But for the hard work of a number of people over the decades and indeed centuries, we would never have heard this great work. In fact, we probably wouldn't even have heard of Vivaldi. This is a story of tragedy, of neglect, of greed, of love, extortion, war, fire, fascism, and ultimately the triumph of music over adversity. And this all really starts after Vivaldi died. But before we get to the big story, we need to actually talk about the man himself, Antonio Vivaldi, who was born in 1678, just a couple of years before Handel and Bach, and died in 1741. He is now considered an acclaimed composer. His works are often in the top 10s of halls of fame all around the world, and you can hear widespread performances of his music. I was recently in Amsterdam, walking around the Rijksmuseum, and there was somebody there playing Vivaldi's Four Seasons on an accordion. His music is ubiquitous. He was a violinist, a concertmaster, a teacher, and he made significant contributions to the development of music, in particular the concerto genre. His most famous instrumental work is, of course, the Four Seasons, and he composed numerous sacred works such as the Gloria, many settings, in fact, of the Gloria, the Stabat Mater, the Magnificat, and, as Choir of the Earth know, the Dixit Dominus. But he also composed secular works, and he was in his time very well known as an opera composer. But what might surprise you is that Vivaldi and his music remained relatively unknown to the general public attending concerts until the 1950s. Yeah, the 1950s. So let's go back. Let's talk about Vivaldi at the pinnacle of his career in the 1720s here in Venice. He embodied the epitome of a prosperous entrepreneur in the music realm. He had his finger in all sorts of pies, ladies and gentlemen, not just the sacred music, but also, as I say, the secular music as well, and in particular opera, which was an enormous boom industry in Venice at the time. And despite having been born into humble circumstances, he pursued a path into the priesthood, as we know, augmenting not only his social status, but also that of his family in Venice, which was an influential hub known for its opulence, its power, and its popularity amongst visitors. And I think that still continues to this day. Now, throughout his life, Vivaldi maintained his clerical status despite being a non-practicing priest for much of it. This earned him the affectionate moniker Il Prete Rosso, or the Red Priest, owing to his distinctive red hair. And it's believed that Vivaldi's father, Giovanni Battista Vivaldi, who was also a musician, shared this physical attribute, and he went by the nickname Battista Rossi. And Vivaldi and his father were very, very close, as we'll soon hear, and this would have an impact on Vivaldi later on. Vivaldi excelled not only as a musician and composer, but also as a skilled teacher. As we know, he taught the orphans of the rich and wealthy landowners. That's to say, that they were orphans. They were usually the illegitimate children of the rich and wealthy who were placed here in the Ospedale della Pieta under Vivaldi's tutelage, and were left substantial sums of money so they could be brought up properly, albeit not acknowledged as part of the noble families from which they came. But Vivaldi not only was a teacher, he was also an opera impresario. As I said, a shrewd entrepreneur, made quite a lot of money. However, During the 1730s, the economic situation in Venice experienced a continuous decline. This was accompanied by swift transformations in the city's musical preferences. So the public's tastes changed rather quickly. And we can see this being echoed not just in Venice, but all around the world. Handel was facing similar challenges in London. And by the mid-1730s, Antonio Vivaldi found himself facing significant financial hardship. His operas failed to captivate the audiences, and his musical style fell out of fashion, leading to a decline in demand. And if you know your music history, you'll know that the 1730s, we're looking at a change in taste, a move away from the traditional Baroque styles towards the music of the Enlightenment, towards simpler melodies, towards different instruments, and of course Vivaldi, with his feet firmly in the style of the Baroque, would have found himself facing a challenge. And consequently, the income generated from concert sales to affluent European visitors, which had once been a primary source of revenue for Vivaldi, this dwindled. And this led to his enduring association of 25 years with this organisation here, the Teatro Sant'Angelo, the opera house situated near the Rialto Bridge on the Grand Canal. This came to an end, 25 years, and then suddenly no more. And in 1740, rather fatefully, Vivaldi's contract with the esteemed Ospedale della Pieta, where he'd been teaching, conducting and composing for nearly 40 years, this contract was not renewed. And amid these professional devastations, a personal tragedy of even greater magnitude unfolded. Vivaldi's father, who I mentioned earlier on, who'd served as his initial music instructor, his occasional scribe, his mentor, his travel companion, friend and ardent supporter, died on May the 14th of 1736 due to unknown causes, though it's suspected that it was to do with polluted water. So Vivaldi found himself there in 1740 with no job. His most ardent supporter was gone, and his artistic, therefore, and financial prospects were bleak in Venice. So in 1740, Vivaldi upped sticks and moved to Vienna, as many composers did at that time. Mozart was to follow suit some 50 years later. We think he may have relocated in order to gain the patronage of Emperor Charles VI, who'd shown some interest in employing Vivaldi in his court. We also suspect he moved there to try and re-establish his career as an opera composer. Vienna was, as it is now, a hub, a central point of opera in Europe. However, soon after Vivaldi arrived in Vienna, Charles VI, as we can see here, died from eating poisonous mushrooms. And unfortunately, he took Vivaldi's chances for a royal patronage with him to the grave. And more damaging even than that to Vivaldi's career was the period of official royal mourning that was observed following the emperor's death. This meant that opera performance was banned for a full year after Charles's death. Vivaldi was ruined. And in 1741, just a year after arriving in Vienna, Vivaldi died at the age of 63. He received a very modest funeral at St. Stephen's Cathedral because he was at that point, I'm afraid, a pauper, and he was interred in the nearby hospital burial ground. And we can see here the plaque that's been put up since then, but it was a bit like poor old Mozart. It was a rather ignoble end to an illustrious career. Now, after his death, some private collectors possessed a few Vivaldi instrumental works that had been published during his lifetime, including, of course, The Four Seasons, which was a breakthrough success for him. But it was believed that the main body of work that had been Vivaldi's was forever lost. However, 100 years later, a large collection of Vivaldi's manuscripts was discovered in a dusty cupboard at the Hofkirche Cathedral in Dresden. Dresden? Vivaldi never visited Dresden. How did they get there? Well, it seems that a violinist and concertmaster named Johann Pisendel had met Vivaldi in around about 1716. And he'd been travelling throughout Europe, travelled to Venice, I should say, and met Vivaldi, and had started taking lessons with him, both in performance and in composition. And it seems they formed a friendship and a strong bond, with examples of Vivaldi's handwriting visible in Pisandel's scores from the time. And Pisendel actually spent quite a lot of time in Vienna, returned there many times. And throughout the 1720s and 1730s, Vivaldi maintained correspondence with Pisendel and sent him various compositions. Although a small number of vocal and choral works found their way to Dresden, the majority of the pieces that Vivaldi sent were instrumental. This is not surprising given that Pisendel was an instrumentalist, and it's pretty likely that even though there are a couple of choral works in this trove in Dresden, they were never performed by Pisendel because, as I say, he was a violinist. Now, following Pissendel's passing in 1755, his personal library, including Vivaldi's works, was carefully preserved. It was placed alongside other private libraries in a sizable cabinet labelled simply 2 in Roman numerals, and this was positioned behind the organ at the court chapel of the Hofkirche Cathedral in Dresden. And there this cabinet remained unopened for a century. An entire century. Nobody opened it, safeguarding therefore its contents in almost remarkable seclusion and very, very high levels of preservation. And these Dresden manuscripts are an essential part of the preservation and rediscovery of Vivaldi's works, but I'm afraid the Gloria was not among those papers. The majority, as I say, were instrumental works. So we will return to this Dresden collection shortly. But we need to jump from Germany back to Italy. And in 1926, a Professor Alberto Gentili, who was a music history professor at the University of Turin, received a communication from Luigi Torri, who was the director of the Turin National University Library. Torri informed Gentili about a recent discovery of ancient music manuscripts in trunks here at the San Carlo Salesian Monastery near Turin in Monferrato. The monastery was considering selling these manuscripts to antique dealers, and the Monsignor sought the assistance of the Turin Library in assessing their value. So crates containing these manuscripts that had been kept at the monastery for goodness knows how long were sent to Professor Gentili for evaluation. Upon the arrival of the crates in the autumn of 1926, Gentili eagerly opened them and discovered an enormous treasure trove of Vivaldi manuscripts, bound volumes containing numerous concertos, operas, sonatas, and sacred choral works, including a significant number of Vivaldi's autograph manuscripts. That is to say, the manuscripts that Vivaldi himself wrote and kept in a bound edition. This was a remarkable find, as the majority of Vivaldi's works, as I said, had been considered largely lost or unknown since his death in 1741, nearly 200 years earlier. And this is widely considered one of the most significant discoveries in the entire history of musicology. And you might think that the rediscovery of these manuscripts would have been the cause for great celebration and a total renovation in Vivaldi's fortunes as a composer. Well, think again, because this tale's about to get even more interesting, folks. Now, Director Torri and Professor Gentili wanted to keep the manuscripts in Turin, but couldn't afford to purchase them. Remember, they had been found in the monastery, and the Monsignor wanted to sell them. Now, there was concern that the Italian government, then headed by Mussolini, might relocate the manuscripts, or that antique dealers might divide and sell them, that is, splitting up the collection. And at that point, if scores were sold to private collectors, they would just disappear into private collections, never to be seen again. So Gentili needed a benefactor, and he reached out to a chap called Roberto Foa, who was an industrialist, who purchased and donated the manuscripts to the Turin Library in 1927. And in doing so, he gave the collection the name of her son, who had died in infancy. Now, further examination of this collection revealed missing pages, and indications were that the collection had once been larger and had been divided haphazardly. So the story's not over yet. We've got a collection of scores in Dresden. We've got this massive collection in Turin, but it's missing bits. So where had these pieces gone? Gentili searched for the missing portions, working in secrecy to prevent competition from the fascist government or private collectors. Dr. Faustino Curlo joined the search, and they discovered connections between Vivaldi and the Durazzo family of Genoa. And we can see here Count Giacomo Durazzo, who had acquired the manuscripts from Venetian collectors in the late 1700s. After various transfers, the manuscripts ended up divided between the Durazzo brothers Marcello and Flavio. And Marcello's portion was left to the San Carlo Salesian Monastery, which became this Foa collection, which we've just heard about. But the other collection was passed down through the Durazzo line, and Dr. Curlo managed to locate the last living Durazzo heir, who was called Giuseppe Durazzo. Now, I couldn't find a picture of him, so I found one of his ancestors to indicate just how noble this family considered themselves. Now, negotiations with Giuseppe Durazzo were difficult because he was rather a difficult man. He viewed Vivaldi's scores and manuscripts as his family's property, and he was very angry that half of this collection had ended up at the monastery and had therefore been sold to the Turin University. Now, eventually, Durazzo gave permission to sell the manuscripts. However, he applied a stipulation that prohibited either publication or performance of these compositions. So they could be sold, but it was on the condition that they would never be published and they would never be performed. A difficult man indeed. Now, Filippo Giordano, an Italian textile manufacturer, provided funds to purchase this other half of the collection from Durazzo, and they were presented, these manuscripts, to the Turin National University Library in memory of Filippo Giordano's deceased son. So both halves of the collection were given the honorific name for a deceased son by both of the benefactors. That's just one of the facts and one of the more interesting parts of this story. Now, the Turin manuscripts comprising the Foa and Giordano collections represent over 90% of Vivaldi's known autographs, and they remain to this day at the Turin National University Library. And you can make an appointment to go and view the scores. They will make you wear rubber gloves before you touch the scores. But that is not the end of the story, because the discovery of these Turin manuscripts did not lead to immediate progress in promoting Vivaldi's music. And Durazzo's stipulations of no publication, no performance very much hindered the promotion of Vivaldi's music. But these stipulations were mostly set aside in 1938 when Durazzo died, having fought a court case to the very, very end, and the courts sided on the side of the library. However, Italy's alignment at the time with Nazi Germany and the passing of anti-Jewish legislation created obstacles for promoting Vivaldi's music. You see, Gentili, pictured here, was Jewish, and he'd been overseeing the Turin manuscripts, but he was forced out of public life due to Italy's anti-Jewish laws. And those two key benefactors, Foa and Giordano, they too were also Jewish. So at this point, Vivaldi's manuscripts, although they've been discovered, they are languishing here in the late 1930s. But at this point, the story turns to two more rather unlikely characters, because at this point, after Gentili's departure from the story, the highly regarded at the time American poet Ezra Pound and his mistress Olga Rudge became important figures in Vivaldi's rediscovery. Now, we'll hear more about Ezra shortly, but Olga Rudge worked as a secretary at the Accademia Musicale in Siena, and she founded the Centre for Vivaldi Studies. And in the mid-1930s, she travelled to Turin to make a catalogue of the Vivaldi manuscripts. And eager to support his mistress, Ezra Pound requested copies of the Vivaldi manuscripts from the University of Dresden. That's the collection that was found behind the organ, and this is going to be vital to the story later on. And he passed copies both in terms of transcribed copies and microfilms. He passed these to the Centre for Vivaldi Studies in Siena. And Ezra Pound also requested microfilms from the National University in Turin. Now, when he requested this initially, he was turned down. So he contacted Mussolini's Minister of Education, who rang the library and told them to dig out Vivaldi for him. I like that particular turn of phrase. And at this point, an Italian cultural nationalist and composer called Alfredo Casella, along with Olga Rudge, they assisted in organising the first ever Vivaldi festival. And this took place in September of 1939. That's obviously a very important date, not just for Vivaldi, but also for the world. And this was the first time Vivaldi's music had been heard, including kind of a version of the Gloria. It wasn't complete. It was Casella's arrangement. There were several movements missing, and some of the movements didn't follow anything like Vivaldi's intentions, but it was the first time Vivaldi's music had been heard in public, other than brief snatches of the Four Seasons, since his passing in 1741. Now, this festival received quite a lot of pre-event publicity, but was overshadowed by Warsaw's surrendering to the Nazis a few days later and the outbreak of World War II. Now, during the war, both Turin and Dresden faced significant bombing. The Vivaldi manuscripts in Turin were preserved in the vaults below the library, but despite the Dresden manuscripts having been locked into vaults, the Dresden manuscripts were very badly damaged when the Allies firebombed the city in 1945. Thanks to Ezra Pound, over here, despite him being a horrible anti-Semite and working for the Mussolini fascist government, because he'd requested these transcriptions and these microfilms from Dresden, these were saved at this Vivaldi Institute in Siena. And this saved, we estimate, around 30% of Vivaldi's works from having been burnt up in the Dresden fires. Both Casella and Pound supported the fascist government during the war, and Pound, as you can see here, wrote and delivered anti-Semitic and pro-fascist speeches on behalf of Mussolini, for which he was very well paid. And Olga Rudge became much less active in promoting Vivaldi, largely due to her commitment to Pound. So they leave the story at this point, having had, despite their rather unfortunate political views, to say the least, they had a significant impact on preserving Vivaldi for us. But the story now moves to the end of the Second World War, and following the conclusion of hostilities, Europe embarked on a challenging path of recovery and reconstruction. And in the midst of this journey, the rediscovery of Vivaldi's music emerged as a significant part. In 1947, 2 years after the war's end, this chap here, Antonio Fana, established the Italian Antonio Vivaldi Institute in Venice, bringing him home where he belonged. The primary objective of this institute was to promote and perform the works of Antonio Vivaldi, and collaborating with the Venetian composer Malipiero and, vitally, Ricordi Publishing in Milan. Remember that name from the start of the talk? Fana embarked on the ambitious task of publishing a comprehensive edition of Vivaldi's music, but they only started with the instrumental music. Ricordi weren't interested at the time in choral publications. They were almost entirely instrumental. And it was this chap now, we're going to jump across the Atlantic to the USA to meet this man here. This is Louis Kaufman, who was an American violinist, and he performed part of the Four Seasons at a special recorded live performance at Carnegie Hall in 1947. We believe this is the first time that the work had been performed in the States, and it was not complete, vitally. There were only a few sections that had been found on pieces of manuscript, and no full edition had made it over to the States at that point. So Kaufman searched high and low for a complete Four Seasons score. He took his fiancée, and the two of them travelled extensively through Europe for many months, and after a search across, well, and they were about to give up actually, they found a complete score in Brussels that had been published back then in the 1700s. He took it back to the USA, transcribed it, and in 1950, Kaufman recorded the entire Four Seasons in Zurich. And this won the Grand Prix du Disque. It was the most popular disc of the year. And this vastly increased interest in Vivaldi's music, because, of course, it was not just about the performance of the music, it's the fact that we're now talking about a world that has access to recordings. And so everyone could buy this amazing disc and could listen to it. And you can still listen to it to this day. And so this increased interest in Vivaldi spurred those who were publishing his works to dig out more works, to employ more people. Ricordi found themselves with an awful lot of interest, not just in the instrumental works here, but in the choral works. And this led to, in 1957, Vivaldi's original version of the Gloria being finally published by the publishers Ricordi. And Casella presented, although Casella had presented his original arrangement of the Gloria in 1939, this first world premiere of the full edition to be heard since Vivaldi's death was at the Brooklyn College's first festival of Baroque choral music in 1957. And you can see here, this is something like page 14 of the newspaper. It's a tiny, tiny little announcement announcing this Brooklyn College Festival of Choral Music, where the Vivaldi Gloria was first performed in 1957. And it quickly became one of the foundations, as I said, of our choral repertoire. So the next time you sing or listen to Vivaldi's Gloria, or indeed the Dixit Dominus or the Magnificat or any of his choral works, I want you to spare a thought for the people who brought between them Vivaldi's music back from the brink, from the abyss, who brought it through time, through a story, as I say, of neglect, of greed, of fire, of fascism, to your hand, the score that you hold when you sing Vivaldi's Gloria, that you are now part of this story, and all these people have contributed to it, and regardless of their personal beliefs and their personal politics, each one of them is vital. Without these people, we would not have had this glorious music. And I need to thank a very important person in the creation of this talk. I have to thank Professor Miles Fish of the Arkansaw College of Music, who wrote this fantastic, absolutely fantastic article in 2015. It was published in the American Choral Journal. It's called Discovering the Rediscovery of Antonio Vivaldi, and it is well worth looking up. I've put a link in the description to part of the article. I'm afraid it is behind a paywall. I had to pay to access it, but I'm sure you'll agree, having listened, it is a very interesting story and well worth doing so. So everyone, I do hope you've enjoyed this whistle-stop tour through the rediscovery of Vivaldi's Gloria. I do encourage you to listen to it and just hold in your heads just everything that it went through to get from Vivaldi's pen to your ears over those centuries. And just consider, whenever you listen to a piece of music, there is almost always a story, particularly with these older pieces. There is a story behind it.